Hi everyone, Helen Blunden here. I hope you're happy, healthy and well. It is time for a new book review where I share some life lessons out of the books that I have been reading. Let's talk about the book I want to talk about today, which has really thrown me out, I must say. And it is Wifedom, Mrs. Orwell's Invisible Life by Anna Funder. Now you may have seen this book out on the shelves because it is a new book. It is newly published and you can see how many notes I've made here because this book really made me sit up and think and actually challenge some of my own perspectives. Initially, when I started reading this book, I did wonder where she was going with this, but it ended up being more of an introspection on my part and my perspective on George Orwell's writing. Now, you know this channel is all about life lessons from books, and what that means is I'm a firm believer that what you read is a way for you to start questioning how you live your life, how you think, why you think that certain way. So for me, books present an opportunity to question not what I'm reading, but question what I'm reading in the perspective and the context of my own life and why I do the certain things that I do that way. So in actual fact, it presents different viewpoints that I can consider and improve on myself. So I think about it more in the sense of personal development or reflection on why I do the things I do. Now, I'm saying that simply because I am a huge George Orwell fan. I have all of his books, I have some of his biographies, I have his letters and his diaries, and I've only not read just two of his books, Homage to Catalonia and one more, but everything else I have read. I even have some of the authors like Christopher Hitchens on writing of Orwell's. So there's a lot of books I have of George Orwell simply because I loved the books that he wrote. I loved the stories. I loved how he wrote it. I loved him depicting life as he was, and also the insanity of war and also the unfairness in life. And then reading this book challenged me and my thinking in a big way. Initially, it was really interesting because what we have here is Anna Funder has done a whole ton of research, and you can see it and you can confirm it because there's footnotes and there's bibliographies and so forth. All of George Orwell's stuff is out there. But what she has done is that she has discovered 6 letters written between the period of 1936 and 1945 by Eileen O'Shaughnessy, who was George Orwell's first wife. She was a very smart woman, Oxford graduated, real card, so to speak. Just the way she wrote in her writing just made me realize she would have been a really intelligent woman, a very smart woman, self-deprecating as well, and funny too. Anna Funder discovered these 6 letters, and what she did was she delved into them deeply and thinking and putting herself in the shoes of Eileen O'Shaughnessy, working and living and being a wife to this writer, George Orwell. Eileen came from I guess a richer background than what George Orwell did. It's the stuff in here that made me sit up and think about and questioning why I kind of accepted everything that George Orwell had written without realizing that behind every great man is a great woman, and how much of his work had been influenced by his wife. I didn't question that, and so this book made me sit and think about who Eileen O'Shaughnessy was and just how much of her influence was there in George Orwell. And then I started to think, am I actually liking the influence of Eileen on George Orwell's writing, or was it George Orwell? Anna Funder in this book brings to light some very big themes and concepts. She draws out the patriarchy that was so prevalent in that age when George Orwell was writing. And I have to admit that there were times where I thought to myself, this guy's a prick. He talks about pouncing, he talks about, chasing women, and he had affairs, and even though it was his wife who kind of kept his house, kept everything right for him so he can write, both of these people, this couple, struck me as kind of like a codependent relationship where on the one hand you have this man who is charming, fall over themselves to speak to him, but also he's somewhat of a klutz. He's somewhat naive in some way, and it's all about him and his writing and his creativity. Meanwhile, his wife, Eileen, is also a smart woman who is intelligent, who has worked in the ministries. She's the one who is working to keep them afloat. She's the one who is doing everything around this house of theirs that is in a decrepit situation. They don't have hot water. They don't have a toilet. She has to do all the work. She's out in the garden. She does everything just to give him the time, as a good wife does back then, so he can write. And so all these things started to challenge my perception of George Orwell, because I found myself that I had taken on his viewpoint and his biographer's viewpoint without realizing who was he without Eileen, who was he without a wife. And this is where Anna Funda started talking about this concept of wifedom and this concept of when you have creatives in a relationship, that someone has got to give up their time in order to allow the other person, this creative, to thrive. And yet what happens is one of them starts to get and become invisible. In George Orwell's life, we see that Eileen O'Shaughnessy has become invisible, except in those 6 letters we get a glimpse of what she was like and the challenges that she had. Now, one of the saddest things I found is that in one of the last letters, she, and I can also confirm that it is in this Life of Letters book, that she starts to put down herself and starts to say that, I mean, both of them were really sick. Both of them were sick as each other. They were actually sick as in health-wise. But she puts down the fact that she doesn't want to spend the money. She doesn't feel as if she can spend money on an operation for her health to make her feel better, because she doesn't feel valued in that sense. She doesn't feel she's worth. And that is one of the saddest things I had to read. This book brings up some interesting concepts about the role of a wife, especially at this time, and especially a role of a wife and a woman who is smart, intelligent, who helps her husband become famous and who helps him in his work, and yet she's discounted, unacknowledged, invisible, irrelevant, and even made invisible by biographers. Anna Funda came up with this concept which made me sit long and hard and thinking about this. And she found this idea of the passive voice in George Orwell's writing. The passive voice, for those of you who have learned language and grammar, is when something is being done to you. The passive voice, Anna Funda said, was an indication that Eileen was there in the background doing a lot of the stuff and helping George Orwell out, but he doesn't mention her in his diaries and his letters simply because it was being done for him by a woman, and who knows, for whatever reason, why he didn't write the role of Eileen in his life and the work that he did, and also the work when he was in Spain fighting the fascists. So we get a lot of passive voice everywhere in his writing, and we can then assume that Eileen was there in the background. The way Anna Funda has written this book is very different. It is not non-fiction, it is not fiction. It is, sometimes it is an autobiography. So she's melded a few of the genres up, and initially I thought to myself, oh, I'm not liking where this is going. Why couldn't she just have written it in a fiction form, making it like a novel? But in that sense, if it was a fiction or a novel, maybe we wouldn't have had Eileen's voice as strong, and maybe it wouldn't have allowed us to sit and think about the themes that Anna Funda was trying to say here about patriarchy and about wifedom, about the value of time for creatives and who creates that time and how do you balance that time. I also liked how Anna Funda really aligned to how I sit and think about books. How do I apply my life? And so what she did was she integrated, I guess, aspects of her own life and how she was also going down the rabbit warren, much like what I do with George Orwell stuff, and then trying to make some connections with what was happening in her own family life and her own work. So I got what Anna Funder was doing. In the end, the more I read about it, I really got into it. I was picking this book up so often because I wanted to be challenged with my own thinking about George Orwell. There were times where I started to think to myself, okay, so what do I do here? I've got a whole collection of George Orwell books. Do I get rid of them? Do I cancel the man? And then I thought, I can't do that either, because if I do that, then there's still some aspects of George Orwell's work that I like. And we don't know which part is Eileen's, and we don't know her influence and where exactly it was. But I really started to question whether I liked actually George Orwell's writing or whether I liked Eileen's influence. Because Eileen, to me, was someone that I thought, man, I could relate to her so much. Her self-deprecating humour. I can also understand the situation that she was in a patriarchy society of having to appease her husband. I guess coming and growing up in a very strict household and coming up, against some concepts of having to get married and look after your husband and putting your own needs aside to look after your husband's. That's the stuff I grew up on. So I actually started to understand Eileen's perspective on this. And so I don't think cancelling the person is the answer. And I'm certainly not going to get rid of my George Orwell books. But the more I read, the more I thought, man, he's such a prick. He's such a prick on how he treats them. And I started to think about, why am I feeling this way? It's because I know women who have been treated like this, smart, intelligent, wonderful women who have been treated like this by their partners. But then I also thought to myself, at the very same time, I was going through a writer's workshop in Mulberry Hill. Now, Mulberry Hill is a very famous estate that is heritage listed here in Melbourne, and it is the home of Joan Lindsay, who's a very well-known author here in Australia who wrote Picnic at Hanging Rock. And in her book, which is a biography of sorts, called A Time Without Clocks, I went to her estate at Mulberry Hill to do a writer's workshop. This book explained the life of Joan Lindsay and her husband Darrel Lindsay. Both were creatives, both were around the same time, maybe earlier than George Orwell and Eileen O'Shaughnessy. Here were two creative people, a male and female, no kids. I'm not going to say well off because they did have difficult times in their life. Those two balanced time out. And in fact, in Joan Lindsay's book, A Time Without Clocks, she recounts her time in Mulberry Hill, this wonderful homestead filled with art, and where there are no clocks, because she didn't believe in time, she didn't believe in clocks, where both she could write her book, and that's where she wrote A Picnic at Hanging Rock, and where Darrel could do his artwork. He was an artist at the time. And here were two artists, male and female, living together in balance, expressing their lives and their creative selves in a surrounding that was conducive to creativity, that was conducive to their best work, and both together were balanced. I guess they were the yin and yang. And you could feel this at Mulberry Hill when you go to the place. I'm going to bet that you probably can't feel this way at Wellington, at this decrepit old house that George Orwell lived. Here was, I guess, a juxtaposition of the thinking that I was doing at Mulberry Hill of this couple who were quite creative, versus George Orwell, who expected a wife, who expected a servant, who expected to have his life in such a way that was going to be quiet so that he could spend time on his creative pursuit, on his writing. I started to think about the differences here, and what is it about two creative people, two people who in a relationship, why does one have to concede time over the other? Who makes that choice? Why do they make that particular choice? You can't help but wonder, I guess, and you never know how they decide this thing, and how they decide, and how couples decide the balance of time and the balance of creativity and the balance of exploring their own skills and needs, creative needs and creative expressions in a family. And once children come into play, that makes it all the more difficult, and the onus goes onto the woman to have to look after the family, thus putting her own creative expressions and needs aside. This book really got me thinking on a whole aspect of themes about time, about creativity, about how couples balance time, what happens in the life of couples, married couples, and the choices they make to support each other in whatever format, but then what are the consequences of that? How does one person get negated, one person gets discredited, unacknowledged, invisible in that aspect? And how much have they played in the success of the other person? It made me come to realize that I can't discount Orwell. I can't cancel him out. You can't start doing that. If you start cancelling everyone out, then you're not going to have any artworks. You're not going to have anything really. But if anything, I think this book made me appreciate and made me question that behind every man is a great woman. Behind every person who puts something out in the world, anything creative, anything artistic, anything worth making us sit and think and ponder our lives, any painting, any piece of artwork, any writing, anything at all, there is someone else out there behind them who is also helping them and who is also influencing them. That's what I learned. I also learned that through being at Mulberry Hill and also learning about how two creatives can balance each other out and can also be in a time in a society, in Joan Lindsay's time, it was in the 1920s, where it was a patriarchal society. What's it dependent on? Is it dependent on the thinking of the people at the time? Maybe that were males who were in the patriarchy who actually saw the value of women, saw them for who they are. Maybe we shouldn't just kind of broad brush everything and saying that back then, it was a system of all men being this way to their women. Maybe they weren't. Maybe there were just men who were utter pricks to their women, full stop, regardless of the time. So lots of thinking and reflecting for me in this book, A Wifedom. I would highly recommend this book. Like I said initially, it irked me because I actually wanted to really sit and think, why I was so confronted by this. And I was confronted simply because I didn't question who was the man behind all of his work. I simply didn't question it enough, much like many of the biographers out there. That's all I want to say and share about Wifedom, Mrs. Orwell's Invisible Life. She's out there. Eileen O'Shaughnessy is out there now, and I'm so glad that Anna Funder has given her a voice and has given us things to think about when it comes to creative expression and articles and products that are put out there for us to look at and then question how they came about and who was behind it. So thank you for listening and thank you for watching. Bye for now.